Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be looking at, of course, the political situation of the country and what has been going on since we have seen the Supreme Court's verdict regarding Punjab Chief Minister's elections, in which PMLQ's votes were counted as valid, also terming the decision earlier taken by the Deputy Speaker of the Punjab Assembly as unconstitutional. In the aftermath of all of that, we've seen that the PDM has, of course, initially boycotted the proceedings with regards to the full court bench demand being rejected. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the decision that had come out, also they had presented forth the arguments regarding the issue of judiciary and its involvement in the constitutional matters of the country, and how there is need for judicial reforms, and how this was indeed a complicated constitutional matter which warranted a full court bench, and because of that they reject the current particular decision as well. And they have been talking about political reforms with regards to the judiciary, and of course this discussion was being held at the National Assembly as well, in which Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif also raised questions regarding the double standards and two constitutions existing, and there being different standards of justice for different people. We've also seen the Foreign Minister also speak in the National Assembly, talking about the need of a parliamentary committee and the need for judicial reforms in the country, and how that is imperative in terms of protecting the constitution, which the PPP also in particular fought for. We've also seen that the Prime Minister has written a tweet as well, talking about his arguments presented in the National Assembly, saying that it is important that the institutions realize the domains that have been given to them, and they work under those domains as well, which is important for the constitution and, of course, the democratic movement of the country as well. So we're going to now further explore what has been going on in terms of the questions that are being raised regarding judicial reforms, why they are necessary, why is it important, why especially now these issues are being talked about when earlier decisions have also been taken with regards to a three-member bench, and of course what happened today in terms of the Judicial Commission of Pakistan, in which 5 judges of the High Court that were under nomination and consideration for the Supreme Court nominated by the Chief Justice of Pakistan, their nominations were not approved by the Judicial Commission of Pakistan, and how the issue of the seniority principle was discussed, and many senior judges and their nominations not being given was questioned. So we're going to try and see what exactly is going to be the future course of action regarding that as well, since the Chief Justice left the proceedings without explaining what is now going to happen next. So we're going to explore that in further detail as well, and then of course the impact it's going to have on the political situation of the country, and how the political parties would want to proceed forward, considering, of course, the economic situation of the country as well, where we are seeing that the dollar rates keep on going high. So we're going to be talking about all of that in the debate today, and as always, I've been joined in the studios by Farrukh Pitafi and Faisal. And we've also been joined by our guests online. We've been joined by Dr. Hassan Shahzad, who's a political analyst. We're also going to be joined by Barrister Saeed Raza Ali, who's a legal expert. We'll also be joined by Justice Retired Shaikh Usmani, who's a legal expert, and Mr. S. Boone, President of the Supreme Court Bar Association. So we'll be, of course, welcoming all our guests once they join us online. But with regards to, of course, what has happened so far, and how the different political parties have reacted to the Supreme Court's proceedings. Farrukh, I'll start with you. When we talk about how the PDM stance has come forward, especially with regards to judicial reforms in the country, we have talked about this earlier as well, as to how this matter has been discussed now and why not before. But let's also talk about why judicial reforms in general also are important for the country, and are something that is, of course, going to benefit the constitution or the democratic progress of the country. And also exactly how are we going to achieve judicial reforms? When we keep talking about other forms of consensus, can we actually have a movement forward where we can see this as being an easy or quick process?
Right, Sana, thank you very much for the opportunity and this question. Let me very humbly point out that in good conscience, I cannot actually oppose the idea of judicial reform,
right,
because for 3.5 years under PTI and many years before during the PMLN government, I have been constantly hammering on that there is a need for judicial reform in this country. But let me, for the convenience of your audiences, invert the paradigm, invert the pyramid, so to speak. We keep on talking about the highest courts in the country, but you have to think about the majority of courts that exist in the country where common man goes for justice, right? And the laws that we have been following so far are PPC, CRPC. They are, the procedural codes actually. They actually were made in the previous century, actually 2 centuries before. And we still have to make do with that. And we haven't been able to update that at all, right? Similarly, when you talk about this dichotomy between criminal law and civil law, you have to realize that many people have faced, courts for decades because their property dispute could not be resolved. I know many cases where the matter 10, 20 years ago came up to the Supreme Court of Pakistan. There it ordered that some kind of mediation should take place, and the case has not been resolved even to this day. So we need a reform, judicial reform. Unfortunately, what happens in our political circle is that whenever there is a contingent factor, some kind of new development, then we suddenly start paying attention to all these problems, even though while we could have done it in the previous many years, right? So at this moment, because of what has happened in the Supreme Court, I think the PDM is pushing for some kind of reforms. But the problem is that today, because of the polarized nature of the society and the community and the country and institutions also, there is a fear that no matter what you do in the parliament, it will be thrown out by the honorable courts. It happened in the case of 18th Amendment, where there was a procedure that was defined, and then the honorable court under Justice Iftikhar, Chaudhry Iftikhar actually took up the matter and then threw it out and requested the parliament to make another law. And then we saw 19th Amendment.
Right.
So at this moment, I think in good conscience, I'm all for judicial reform, and that is very important, right from the bottom to the top. But while that happens, you need some kind of a consensus among all parties, so that you can actually move ahead. And do you honestly see that consensus emerging in this climate? I don't think so.
Right, and that is of course a question that we keep raising regarding our economic situation as well, or any kind of fundamental reforms that are required, and unfortunately that is a hindrance that nobody seems to be dealing with or trying to figure out how we're going to proceed with that. But Faisal, I understand of course Farrukh's sentiment in terms of the way the courts react and how the general public has to face with issues, and of course that is much needed. But like Farrukh was saying, this is some sort of a reaction that we have seen, or some sort of action being taken in the aftermath of this particular decision. So one cannot help but join the two together. So when we talk about this particular stance coming forward regarding judicial reforms, the question of whether or not the Supreme Court violated or extended their domain, or tried to perhaps maneuver with the Constitution, is the question that is being raised at the moment. Whether or not that is the case, we'll be of course asking our legal experts as well. But in terms of these particular domains needing to be existing within different institutions, and for them to remain under them, do you think that this perhaps has been shaken up a bit, where we need to be talking about whether or not the Constitution is at stake?
Well, Sana, this is a very important question. To me, I think Constitution is not on stake. It is a matter of interpretation of law, and we obviously discussed it yesterday's program as well, where we said that legislature is the parliament. Of course, parliament is there to make laws, but when it comes to interpretation of the law, of course it is entirely up to our judiciary and our judges to interpret the law.
Right.
And who are the judges who are interpreting the law? That is where the sort of problem is, and that is why we saw that the PDM was demanding for the full bench hearing, which they did not get, and the three judges obviously who were listening this case, they had the trust deficit on them. Obviously the PDM I'm talking about, and that is why we are hearing about the judicial reforms right now. But earlier Farrukh made an excellent point that and I would fully agree with it. Why? Because I'm someone who has always advocated the democracy in the country, and the essence of democracy, the democracy starts from parliament, and the parliament should be the most powerful institution in Pakistan. And of course, if we look at today's parliament, the opposition is missing out. And to me, I think once parliament is fully occupied by the treasury benches and by the opposition benches, and it's a full parliament there, it would be considered as the people who are representing their people, their constituency people, and that is when the judicial reforms can be discussed and can be talked about, and
right.
that would be considered as a very positive.
Right, and by the way, let us not take away the government's entire case, totally, because today Faisal Siddiqui has written a remarkable piece in Dawn. And there you can see that with this judgment, there seems to be humongous problems, right? So the government might be within its rights to think that there was something amiss in the entire judgment, and that's why it plans to actually send, through President's office or through ordinance, the matter to the Honorable Court again for the constitution of a full court to interpret 63A. But that is a separate matter. At this moment, when you talk about legislation, to the extent that you're redoing the entire system, you need consensus, and that we don't see.
Absolutely. Let me also welcome in the debate Dr. Hassan Shahzad, who's a political analyst, and Barrister Syed Raza Ali, who's a legal expert. They've both joined us online. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us today. I'll start with you, Barrister Ali. When we talk about what has been going on and the questions that are being raised, it seems that the court's jurisdictions are being questioned in terms of whether or not there has been an intervention in the constitutional matters of the country, and whether or not the powers that continue to remain with the Chief Justice at the moment need to be questioned and talked about and revised. Of course, there is need for judicial reforms in a much larger sense as well, but when we only look at these particular factors, and especially in terms of the case that has transpired so far, do you think that there has been an intervention in the constitutional matters of the country, or any step into the domain of the parliament?
Thank you so much. I'm not sure whether we can refer to it as a judicial intervention, but when we talk about the idea of reform, there are many aspects, or there are many dimensions from which this reform can emanate. So there has been a debate, and it was a very recent debate on the appointment of judges that is subject to some kind of reform. There's also a need of reform as far as the constitution of various benches are concerned. And there's a little bit of constitutional history that should not be remiss when we talk about this. And that stems from something referred to as the 19th Amendment, where under Article 175A of the Constitution, the whole appointment and the confirmation of judges was done by the Judicial Committee, the Judicial Commission that was formed, and ultimately the Judicial Commission subsequently diluted the powers of a parliamentary committee, which was supposed to ratify these particular appointments. And this is the famous Munir Bhatti case in 2011, where these judicial appointments of the Superior Court, when Parliament came forward and said that some appointments were not necessary or they had objections regarding them, the Supreme Court ultimately moved swiftly to dilute or to clip the wings of Parliament, of that parliamentary committee. And as a consequence, the government introduced the 19th Amendment, pursuant to which the parliamentary committee role in these appointment of judges is quite limited. They can give recommendations, but those recommendations can only be communicated to the Prime Minister, And those recommendations are justiciable, which means that the Supreme Court can actually challenge or subject those recommendations to a judicial review. There's that thing. There's also the constitution of benches, and that is under the Supreme Court rules of 1980. As it stands, the Honorable Chief Justice has the prerogative to actually appoint benches of the Supreme Court up till 3. And it would not also be remiss to mention that in a corresponding provision, say in the Indian Constitution, that power in constitutional matters has to be a minimum of 5. So,
right. Barrister Ali, I'm glad that you're explaining all these points, but I wanted to actually request you to qualify a very basic, broader macro question. When we talk about judicial reform, what comes to your mind? Only how the senior judiciary is appointed, or the fact that we are working with outdated CRPC and PPC as well?
No, not at all, Farrukh. It's not just simply a case of appointment. It's an across the board reform, and I'm glad you mentioned this because except for the superior judiciary, it is the lower judiciary that ultimately escapes any kind of reform because they're never in the spotlight. There are never headlines regarding how they work. So the entire appointment, the actual the ultimate constitution of benches, and you see it just dovetails into my earlier point that when we talk about reform, we require transparency and not just monopoly of a single institution. If you have parliament that comes into the picture, ultimately judicial reform is a legislative exercise. It's not just a judicial exercise, and that's something that successive governments miss. So the blame lies on them as much as the idea of never to challenge the concept of fulfilling the idea of judicial reform.
I need to ask another question with your permission, Sana, very quickly. Barrister Ali, another question regarding the monopoly you were talking about, that no institution should have monopoly over the process, and I totally get it. But clear one more point for us. It is the supremacy of an institution. Usually it is thought that the 3 branches of government are co-equal. But in Pakistan, we keep on hearing that the parliament is supreme. Can you clarify which actually is the right approach?
No, the parliament is supreme. There's this age-old concept by A.V. Dicey, who was a jurist and a philosopher, who ultimately coined this idea that ultimately Parliament is sovereign, it is supreme. But Parliament's actions are also justiciable. They can ultimately legislation, if it's not in consonance with the Constitution, can be reviewed by competent courts. There has to be a specific dichotomy and a separation of powers. I heard that the Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari made an interesting comment that he quoted the Mustafa Impex judgment, where he stated that since the Prime Minister means cabinet, then the Supreme Court must also mean the actual acquiescence of all the other judges. Now, I don't agree with that point because in Parliament we have an idea of a collective responsibility. But in the Supreme Court, every judge is supposed to be independent. But justice must be seen to be done. So
absolutely. Let me also go to Dr. Hassan Shahzad, who's been waiting for a while now. Dr. Hassan, when we look at, of course, this current situation, first of all, I want to understand in the larger sense the kind of response that you've seen so far from the PDM and the call for judicial reforms. How does this work in the favor politically of the political parties involved in the PDM, and how they want to be able to see their political narrative come forward? Of course, the call for judicial reforms is important, but considering its time, considering when it's being raised after a particular decision has come out that is not in their favor, how do you think this particular strategy is working, whether or not it's going in their favor? And then, of course, the issue of the 19th Amendment that Mr. Raza Ali was speaking about, of course, something that was also raised by Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, and speaking of which, we want to understand whether or not the 19th Amendment, you think, was a good choice.
Thank you for having me. Basically, first we discussed the 19th Amendment. I remember that it was in the days of President Asif Ali Zardari, and in those days, almost on a daily basis, we used to witness suo motu actions by the Supreme Court. And in those days, I remember that Supreme Court reporters, they got very prominent. They used to file stories, and then Supreme Court used to take suo motu actions on them. And it was then when the process of branding of judges started, basically. And at that time, President Asif Ali Zardari, he was very well right in saying that a president has to apply his mind before signing any summary sent to him by the Supreme Court. But the president's right was denied at that time, and now it is encouraging to see that Bilawal Bhutto Zardari has taken up from where his father had left. And now we look at now the perception at present that the PDM is trying to build about the judicial decision in the case of
Right,
Chief
absolutely.
Minister.
Dr. Hassan, I'm sorry, I'll have to interrupt you, and I'll come back to you so that you can answer this question as well. But let me also welcome in the debate Justice Retired Mr. Shaikh Usmani, who's a legal expert. He's joined us online in the debate. Thank you very much, Mr. Usmani. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Usmani, I'd like to start off first of all with the question of judicial reforms. Of course, this is something that is being raised a lot, and we can talk about in the fundamental or principled sense whether or not this is something that is beneficial for the country as well. But in the context of what is going on in the country at the moment as well, how do you see this call for judicial reforms by the political parties?
Well, you see, the situation is that during the time of Iftikhar Chaudhry, when he was a Chief Justice, at that time, the judiciary happened to overreach and did a lot of things which normally the courts don't do. And things like suo motu notices were being taken every now and then. Benches were made of different kinds and all that. So many things were done. But he got away with it because at that time the situation was very different, and Chaudhry Iftikhar was like a populist Chief Justice. So he got away with it. But after he left, I think the judiciary continued to use the powers that he had managed to acquire for himself, and all the other Chief Justices also continued to act in his footsteps. And as a result, so many decisions were made, so many things were done, which were controversial, but nevertheless people didn't bother about it. They accepted all that. And then a process of judicial activism started. And the judiciary did say a lot of things which it should normally not do. So as a result, we now have reached a situation where this business of full court thing, which the PDM wanted a full court for hearing this Chief Minister's election results. This, of course, when this came up, the PDM, they asked for a full court, which of course the Chief Justice didn't agree with, and he dismissed that. So as a result, an atmosphere of so-called confrontation began between the ruling party and the Supreme Court because they boycotted it. They didn't go through with the hearing. Now, in this circumstance, particularly when there is a general confrontation politically, we find that now the PDM, the party in the center, they of course have the judicial power because by virtue of the fact that they are in the center and they control the majority in the National Assembly, they're in a position to introduce laws which in a way or the other they would probably curb this overreach of the judiciary, which they had started doing post Iftikhar Chaudhry's time. So the point is now, I believe I've read the news saying or heard the news that a commission has been formed by the present government where they want to introduce so-called judicial reforms. Now, what kind of judicial reforms would they like to introduce? I think what they would like to introduce is, about which people have been talking a great deal, is first about the way the benches are made, which of course so far is the discretion of the Chief Justice alone. So the formation of benches should, as a matter of principle and as a matter of justice, I think, should be extended to more judges than just one judge, because there is a possibility that one judge may like to have only those people with him whom he particularly relies on. So 2 or 3 judges, particularly in the order of seniority, is probably the right thing to do, which I think is what the present government intends doing. This is one. The other thing is the power to take suo motu actions, notices. Now, this, of course, is something which was done by Iftikhar Chaudhry. It had not been done before. People have been doing that subsequently. Now, that is also something which I think they would like to control or make some principles how this is to be exercised. Then the third thing is about the appointment of judges. For that, of course, there's a present controversy now. I'm just seeing on the news. So appointment of judges, the commission, judicial commission, the way the judicial commission should be formed and how it should perform is something which probably they would like to do.
All right. Yes, Faisal.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Justice Usmani sir, if we look at the current situation, of course it is deeply polarized. The country is deeply polarized, and when it comes to political parties as well, they are obviously, they are not sitting on any issue right now. If we look at the judges, obviously these 3 judges in this particular case, all of these 3 judges were not acceptable to PDM. That's why they boycotted it. In coming future, if 3 or more than 3 judges are assigned for a particular case, will one of the party have the right to simply say that we will not be getting or accepting this nomination, and we would like to have other judges listen in their case?
And Usmani Sahab, you kept using the term overreach previously. I want to understand whether or not there has been any overreach by the courts in the recent days.
In the current case?
Yes.
Well, it's not the question of overreach here. The question was very simple. And the question was that there is this issue of the chief ministership of Punjab, the elections which were held. And there was a decision made where the party, one party or the coalition partner, they decided not, they were told not to vote for, they would vote for one or the other. And when they did actually vote, it was the votes were not counted by the Deputy Speaker and his ruling. Now the question is that there is a background to it, in the sense that the 63A has been interpreted in 2 or 3 other cases. One was the presidential reference which was put up before the Supreme Court, in which they passed an order about de-seating and the votes not being counted, which of course is not in accord with 63A in my opinion. And as a result, the other party, they filed a review petition, which is pending. Now this is a very crucial point, because in this case also, their votes were not counted by the Deputy Speaker. So it is the same thing. If that petition, if that in that reference, the Supreme Court had not held that one who doesn't vote in accordance with the wishes of the party, his votes will not be counted, then this problem would not have arisen. Yeah. Now, since that is under review, it is necessary that should be decided. Secondly, the case where these 20 members who were de-seated, and then fresh elections were held for them, and the by-elections. Now, if those people had not been de-seated, then obviously the present election would not have been held. So, and apparently those people who were de-seated, in accord with Section 63A, which authorizes them to file a petition before the Supreme Court, and they've done that. So that petition is also pending. So now all these issues are interconnected. If one goes, the other doesn't stay. If one stays, the other doesn't stay. So this is, in such situation, it was necessary that there should have been a larger bench, a full court, or whatever, to decide all these cases together so that in one go, everything will be sorted.
All right.
And that is what
PDM
wanted.
Right. Let me also go back to Dr. Hassan, who was earlier making an argument. And Dr. Hassan, you can complete that thought as well with regards to the political party strategy moving forward. But I also want to add to that, to what we were earlier discussing, that perhaps what has transpired can be called in one way or the other, sort of confrontation between different institutions and a sort of questioning of the credibility of the institutions as well. Moving forward, how do you think this is also going to impact the political parties within the PDM?
Thank you. Basically, I am interested in the perception, as they say that justice done is not enough. It should be seen to be done, and the part that deals with seen is about perceptions. And in this particular case, the conflict of institutions, it seems to be a perception, because today, if you look at today's development, then you will see that the Judicial Commission, it has rejected. I was looking at 10 headlines, and each and every media outlet used this word rejected. It rejected the nominations by the Chief Justice. Similarly, in the Parliament, which is and other institutions, they should not be at loggerheads, but in the Parliament, the debate is very steamy that the jurisdictions of courts should be defined, and they should not intervene in parliamentary affairs.
Right.
At present, it is
Dr. Shahzad, I'm glad that you are answering this point and expounding as well. Let me actually, because you actually mentioned two things. One, optics of justice as well, and secondly, you also mentioned that political parties are taking a stand. Now, remember that nothing can be seen in isolation. We are in the election year. Within 1 year, hopefully, or shortly after 1 year, we will see the elections, right? And at this moment, PDM parties got a battering in election in Punjab. Now, the question at this moment, when it comes to the common man on the street, is when you are actually opening up this Pandora box and you are not simultaneously focusing on revising CRPC and PPC, would a common man not think that basically it is not preservation of their right, but the elite's right?
Yes, you are quite right, because at present, common man, if you talk about common man, he thinks that 186 is greater than 179. And this is the point that court has also presented to the people. And it is a simplistic decision, and then add in it or blend it with the notion of piousness and the notion of nobility and virtue. We consider our work as worship. No? These are the notions, and it makes a very heady brew at present. And PDM is going to lose its narrative in public by doing such acts, because the more it do it, the more it will find itself dug up in the ground, and it's each and every narrative.
Okay.
Right. Absolutely. Barrister Raza Ali, I'll come to you now with regards to the Judicial Commission of Pakistan and of course the nominations of 5 judges to the Supreme Court given by the Chief Justice, and them not being approved in this particular Judicial Commission session. But then when we look at this particular situation in itself, and then also in the context of what is going on in terms of the questions that are being raised against the courts and against the powers of the Chief Justice, how do you see this particular move, or in this particular development, in terms of the courts and the impact it's going to have on the future of such decisions? And also, even if we just look at this particular development alone, what exactly do you think this means, or what sort of impact does it have if nominations given by a Chief Justice are not approved?
And by the way, this JCP decision was actually through vote. 5 people actually voted against the notion, and 4 people, including the Chief Justice of Pakistan, voted in favor of the motion, and that's why it was not carried. Barrister Saab.
Yes, well, exactly. So it just goes back to the fundamental question of transparency. Well, we are not aware how these debates in the JCP are conducted, what is the criteria, what is the objectivity in it. They're never recorded, they're not open for the general public. All we hear is ultimately the decisions that are communicated through a press release, that it was a 5-4 or a 6-3. I think the need of the hour is that if we can take a step towards reform, and it's not just judicial reform, it's a reform of every institution, we must strive towards some semblance of transparency. Now, there's an Australian philosopher by the name of Lon Fuller. He said that a moral legal system is one that is clear, one that is coherent, one that is consistent, and one that satisfies the issue of transparency at the very outset. I think we would have a far better idea, and we'd be feeling a lot better if we were provided reasons. And for that, the answer is that the JCP should amend its own rules. The JCP has rules in 2010, which only briefly, they're just almost a one-pager that just refer to the Honorable Chief Justice appointing, calling the actual JCP committee, the hearings. This can actually be expanded. Perhaps we can get an idea on how these hearings are conducted if a transcript is actually filed. Moving forward, perhaps these actual debates can be live streamed. In the US, with every judge who is appointed, they're appointed by the president, but there's a Senate Judiciary Committee that scrutinizes the judge as to what their particular political, judicial, and other preferences are. So I'm a big fan of the idea of transparency, because that ultimately provides some semblance of confidence in a system.
Right, Barrister Saab, if you could also explain what is going to happen next now that these nominations have not been approved. What is the next step?
What does the procedure say?
Well, at the moment, it appears that there are conflicting reports. The actual press release from the Judicial Commission appears to indicate that the matter has been deferred. But other reports appear to indicate, and it's all speculation at this point, that the actual nominations were rejected. So if the latter is the case, then ultimately you will need to call another session, and you might need to either ensure that these appointments are ultimately brought before the JCP again, or some new appointments come in. At the moment, there is confusion and there is opaqueness. So until and unless a clear point of view comes out and a clear criteria is evolved, and I'll come back to my original point that can only be evolved through an amendment under the JCP rules, so that we know.
Just to, Dr. Saab, Barrister Saab, just to qualify or clarify one point, the news reports that have emanated from JCP, they state that the reason why the notion was not carried was that the majority believed that seniority principle was not followed, and that should have been followed. So does that actually provide some kind of future course of action, that certain senior most judges of the High Court actually automatically get nominated?
Yeah, it's a great question. Seniority isn't as a matter of right as far as these nominations are concerned. The only matter with respect to seniority is the appointment of the Chief Justice of the country, which has to be the senior most judge. Yeah. All other appointments are not strictly based on the seniority principle. Now, there have been some very eminent points of view relegating the idea of seniority and stating that it's a good thing. But there are equally other points of view that why should we just have seniority? Why not have a more objective criteria, which is a lot more inclusive, which includes a criteria which is about disposal of cases, ultimately how good a judge has performed. It also should take into account gender-based scenarios. So again, the whole point is about formulating a criteria which is objective, which is transparent, and that can only be done once it is circulated.
Right. Barrister Saab, if you could just clarify one more thing. I know, Faisal, you're eager to ask a question, but I just quickly want to clarify one more thing. That currently the criteria does not require a seniority, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. And very quickly, can you also, if you have the numbers with you, tell us what is the pendency rate at this moment in the top courts of the country, particularly Supreme Court, sir?
No, I don't have the numbers with me. I think
any idea? Any ballpark?
Well, there are a lot. There are a lot, and you see, a lot of that is because of the fact that the Supreme Court captures our entire imagination in terms of matters. It headlines, media, the actual media reports. So yes, absolute pendency of cases is ultimately the most important function of the Supreme Court as well as lower court judges. And that
all right. Thank you very much. Thank you for that explanation, Barrister Saab. Yes, Faisal, the floor is all yours.
Dr. Hassan earlier made an excellent point, and it was justice seen to be done, and to me, obviously, it is something that is observed as a fair justice or fair decision. But to me, a question which I wanted to ask him is, who should decide whether it was fair or not? Because if we look at this current situation, if the parties were exchanged right now, we wouldn't have been having any problems at all. But right now, of course, we are in a quite a tricky situation. So who would decide that, sir?
But this, Dr. Saab, by the way, is a killer question. And I don't think even Faisal understands what a big question he has asked. Because when you talk about perceptions in the end actually end up with the people of Pakistan. Yeah. And we don't have any mechanism, opinion polls or anything to judge whether people view some certain thing in a single way, one way or the other.
Or that the perception should factor in judgments.
Yeah.
Dr. Hassan.
Actually, when we talk about perceptions, to me, and it is proven by research, perceptions are more real than reality. And in this age of mediatization, basically people get gratification by thinking that the decision is wrong. The PTI supporters, they would think that the decision is right. And these perceptions, they gratify basically their political inclinations and their urges. But
no, Dr. Saab, but what is the measure or matrix to judge that perception? Are we going to just go to Twitter handles and see what exactly is there? Or the person who has lost, that should be criteria? Or the people who are actually sitting at their homes, and we have some mechanism to judge that as well?
This is what I was coming up to. Basically, these gratifications that they get, they can be false and they can be real. We need to evaluate the health of democracy, and we need to evaluate the veracity and the quality of these decisions on the scale of rules and laws that are written in the books. This is
who should do that, sir?
Sir,
everyone? Who should do that?
Or 10 odd experts on television or somebody like that?
This is what we call this is the process of mediatization, and in the field now we in our classrooms tell students that media is actually the fourth pillar of the state, along with the judiciary and the
if it is a pillar, it is a very shaky one.
And its role, and it needs to, now it is not the question of independence of media, basically it is the question of independence of judiciary and independence
Absolutely,
of
that is the
parliament.
question. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank
Hasan
you very
Shahzad and Barrister Syed Raza Ali for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And of course, our gratitude to Justice Retired Shaikh Usman, who also joined us in the debate. That's it that we have from the show at the moment. Of course, there's a lot of questions still underway, a lot of discussions. But of course, what's important is that the country does require reforms in so many ways and in so many categories. And it is important for us to be able to look at the economic situation of the country and the future of the country as well. And we hope that the political parties, while they talk about their political future, are also concentrating on that. That's it from the debate. See you tomorrow.